Hi, Reddit. I'm not really sure how to start this, so I'll just dive in. My name's John Griffin. For most of my life, I thought I had things figured out. My wife Linda and I had been married for over a decade. We weren't rich, but we were happy, or at least I thought we were. We built a life together from scratch, climbing out of some really tough financial spots and leaning on each other through it all. Or so I believed. A couple of weeks ago, my older brother Carl called me out of the blue. Carl's always been a bit of a wild card. Growing up, he ran with the wrong crowd and got mixed up in some shady stuff. But in the last few years, he'd turned his life around. He'd opened a small auto repair shop, found religion, and swore he'd left his criminal past behind. He said he had something important to show me, something I wouldn't like. At first, I brushed it off. Carl has a flair for drama, and I figured it was one of his usual exaggerations. But he insisted we meet that evening, so I drove over to his shop after work. When I got there, Carl seemed different. Nervous, almost guilty. He handed me an envelope and said, "John, you need to see this." I didn't want to believe it, but I had to know the truth for you. Inside were photos. Linda, my wife, was with another man in a hotel lobby. They weren't just talking, they were holding hands, laughing, and kissing like two teenagers. My stomach dropped. I couldn't process it at first. This couldn't be real. Linda was supposed to be in Phoenix that week for a business trip. That's what she'd told me. I looked at Carl, my hands shaking. "Where did you get these?" Carl hesitated. "I still have a few connections. When I heard something might be going on, I had someone look into it. I didn't want to tell you without proof." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. My brother, the same one who used to steal my lunch money, had just shattered my world. And yet, I couldn't even be mad at him. He didn't cause this, he uncovered it. "I'm sorry, John," Carl said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You didn't deserve this." I couldn't respond. I sat there staring at the photos, replaying every moment Linda had seemed distant in the last few months. Every late night, every cancelled plan, every excuse about work. When I got home that night, I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed time to think, to process. I barely slept, and when I finally drifted off, all I could see were those photos. That was the night I realized my marriage might not have been as solid as I thought. But I wasn't ready for just how deep the betrayal would go the next morning. I couldn't focus on anything. Linda came down to breakfast like it was any other day. She kissed me on the cheek, poured herself some coffee, and started talking about her day. I just stared at her, wondering how someone could act so normal when they were hiding something so massive. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but every time I opened my mouth, the words got stuck. Instead, I told her I'd be working late, which wasn't true. I needed time to think and figure out what to do. I went to Carl's shop again. He had more than just the photos, he also had video clips. My wife walking into a hotel room with that man, staying there for hours, then leaving with him. Carl explained that he'd had a private investigator follow Linda during one of her business trips. Apparently, this wasn't the first time. "I know this is a lot, John," Carl said, looking genuinely sorry. "But you needed to know." I nodded, feeling numb. I didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't react much at all. It felt like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. "Who is he?" I finally asked. Carl hesitated. "I think he's someone from her office. The PI got his name, Mark something. I can dig into him if you want." I shook my head. I didn't care who he was at that moment. I cared about why this was happening. Linda and I weren't perfect, but I thought we were solid. I thought we had trust. That night, I didn't go home right away. I parked a few blocks away and sat in my car, staring at nothing. My mind was racing. Should I confront her? Should I leave? Was there a way to fix this? When I finally got home, Linda was on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She glanced up and smiled. "You're home late." I forced a smile back and muttered something about traffic. I sat down in the armchair, watching her. She looked so calm, so innocent. It made my blood boil. "Everything okay?" she asked, tilting her head like she genuinely cared. For a split second, I almost said it. I almost told her I knew about Mark, the hotels, the lies. But instead I said, "Yeah, just tired." The next few days were torture. Every time Linda laughed, every time she kissed me, every time she called me babe, I felt like a fool. She was lying to my face, and I was letting her. I started looking for signs. Texts she quickly closed, extra time in the shower, nights she worked late. I realized these things had been happening for months. How had I not noticed? By the weekend, I couldn't take it anymore. I called Carl and told him I needed to confront her. He agreed to come over for backup, just in case things got ugly. That Saturday night, Linda and I were sitting in the living room, watching TV. I turned to her and said, "We need to talk." Her face instantly changed. "What about?" "I know about Mark," I said flatly. Her eyes widened, but only for a moment. Then she tilted her head and said, "What are you talking about?" "I know," I repeated. "I've seen the photos, Linda. I know about the hotels, the trips. I know everything." She sat there, staring at me, her mouth slightly open. Then she laughed, a bitter, forced laugh. "You've got it wrong, John. I don't know what you think you saw, but it's not what you think." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice rising. "I have proof. Photos. Videos. Carl knows too." Her face turned pale at the mention of Carl. "Wait, your brother? Are you serious? You're spying on me." "You're cheating on me," I shot back. What was I supposed to do? She stood up, her hands trembling. "I'm not. It's not like that, John. You're blowing this out of proportion." "Then explain it to me," I demanded, standing up too. "Explain the hotels. Explain Mark. Explain why my wife has been lying to me for God knows how long." Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked like a cornered animal, desperate for a way out. Finally, she said, "Fine. I made a mistake." "Is that what you want to hear?" "It was one time, and it didn't mean anything." "One time," I said, laughing bitterly. "You expect me to believe that?" She crossed her arms and glared at me. "Yes. Because it's the truth." Just then, Carl walked in. He'd been waiting outside, and I'd left the door unlocked. Linda's face twisted in anger. "You brought him here," she yelled. "What the hell is wrong with you, John?" "What's wrong with me?" I shot back. "What's wrong with you? You're the one who's been sneaking around, lying to my face, and you have the audacity to be mad at me." Carl stepped between us. "Enough," he said, his voice firm. "Linda, stop lying. He's got proof. Just own up to it." She looked at Carl, then at me. Her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were from guilt, shame, or anger. "You're both insane," she said, grabbing her purse. "I'm not dealing with this right now." And just like that, she stormed out the door, slamming it behind her. I stood there, shaking with rage and heartbreak, while Carl put a hand on my shoulder. "That didn't go great," he said softly. "No," I replied, staring at the door. "It didn't." After Linda stormed out, the house felt eerily quiet. I sat down on the couch, my head in my hands, while Carl stood by the door, watching me. "She'll be back," he said after a while. "But when she comes, you need to be ready." "Ready for what?" I asked, looking up at him. "To hold your ground," Carl replied. "Don't let her twist this. Don't let her turn it into your fault." I nodded but didn't say much. My mind was spinning. I wanted to scream, cry, throw something, anything to get the weight off my chest. But instead, I just sat there, paralyzed by the reality of what was happening. Carl left about an hour later, telling me to call if I needed anything. Alone, I stared at the clock, waiting for Linda to come back. Midnight passed. Then 1 a.m. Then 2. Still no sign of her. I texted her once, "Where are you?" She didn't reply. By the time I dragged myself to bed, it was nearly dawn. I barely slept, my mind replaying the confrontation over and over. I kept seeing her face, the flash of panic when I said Carl's name, the way she tried to dismiss everything like it didn't matter. It was like I didn't even know the woman I'd married. When I woke up, it was 10 a.m., and Linda still wasn't home. Her car wasn't in the driveway. I texted her again, "We need to talk." Still nothing. Around noon, Carl called. "Any word from her?" "No," I said. "She didn't come back last night." There was a long pause. "You think she's with him?" The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. "I don't know," I said, but deep down, I had my suspicions. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I called Linda, and to my surprise, she answered. "What do you want, John?" she said, her voice sharp. "What do I want?" I repeated, barely able to keep my anger in check. "I want to know where the hell you are." "I'm at a friend's house," she said flatly. I needed space after last night. "Which friend?" I asked. "Mark." There was a pause. "No," she snapped. "It's none of your business." "None of my— Are you serious, Linda? You're my wife. This is absolutely my business." "You're acting crazy, John," she said. "You're spying on me, dragging your brother into our marriage, accusing me of things that aren't even true." "I have proof," I shot back. "Stop lying." She sighed, exasperated. "Fine. I'll come home, and we'll talk. But you need to calm down." I hung up without replying. About an hour later, she pulled into the driveway. She walked in like nothing had happened, dropping her purse on the counter and looking at me like I was the one who needed to explain myself. "I don't even know where to start with you," she said, crossing her arms. "That makes two of us," I said, standing up. "So go ahead. Start explaining." She sighed heavily, like this was some huge inconvenience for her. "I told you. It was one time. I made a mistake. I was feeling neglected, and Mark was just there. It didn't mean anything." I stared at her, my blood boiling. "You expect me to believe that? After everything Carl showed me? After all the lies? All the business trips? You're insulting my intelligence, Linda." Her eyes narrowed. "Carl shouldn't have gotten involved. He's always hated me." "This isn't about Carl," I said, my voice rising. "This is about you. Your choices. Your lies. Don't you dare try to make this about anyone else." She took a step back, her face hardening. "You're not perfect, John. You're always working, always stressed. You barely pay attention to me anymore. Don't you dare blame this on me," I said, pointing at her. "I've been working to give us a life, to give you everything you wanted. And this is how you repay me." She crossed her arms again, glaring at me. "I'm not doing this," she said. "If you can't have a civil conversation, I'm leaving." "Go ahead," I said, stepping aside. "But don't come back unless you're ready to tell me the truth." She grabbed her purse and walked out, slamming the door behind her. For the second time in 24 hours, I was left alone in the house, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. Linda didn't come home that night either. At this point, I stopped texting or calling her. My emotions were a mess, part heartbreak, part rage. Every time I thought about the years we'd spent building our life together, all I could see now were lies threaded through the cracks. The next morning, Carl called me again. "You okay?" he asked. I laughed bitterly. "No, not really. She's still gone." "She's pushing you," he said. "Trying to see if you'll back down." "Well, she can keep pushing," I muttered. "I'm not backing down." Carl hesitated before speaking again. "Listen, I've been digging a little more. About Mark. You want to know what I found?" I closed my eyes, bracing myself. "Go on." "He's not just some random coworker," Carl said. "He's one of her senior managers. Married. 2 kids." Hearing that made my stomach turn. "Of course he is," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "She always said her job was stressful because of her boss." Guess that was a half-truth. "There's more," Carl said. "Apparently, they've been seen together outside of work for months. Lunches, drinks, that kind of thing. This wasn't just some random mistake, John." I hung up shortly after, unable to hear any more. I spent the rest of the day pacing the house, wondering how long she'd been laughing behind my back. I thought about calling a lawyer, but something held me back, maybe a faint, pathetic hope that this could still be salvaged. Linda came home that evening. She walked in like nothing had happened, and when she saw me sitting in the living room, her expression turned defensive. "We need to talk," I said, standing up. "I thought we already did," she replied coldly, dropping her purse on the counter. "Not really," I said. "Because you're still lying to me." Her jaw tightened. "What now, John?" "I know who Mark is," I said. "Your boss. Your married boss with 2 kids. How long has this been going on, Linda? How long have you been making a fool out of me?" She froze for a moment, then quickly regained her composure. "I told you it was one time." "That's a lie," I snapped. "Don't even bother denying it." She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. Carl did some digging. You've been seen with him for months. So stop insulting me and tell me the truth. Her face hardened, and for the first time, she dropped the act. Fine, she said, crossing her arms. You want the truth? It wasn't just one time. It's been going on for a while. Her admission knocked the wind out of me. I had expected it, but hearing her say it out loud still felt like a punch to the gut. How long? I demanded. Does it matter? She said, rolling her eyes. It's over now. Over. I said, laughing bitterly. You expect me to believe that? It is, she shouted. I ended it when you found out. I'm sorry, okay? But you're acting like I'm some kind of monster. I stared at her, barely able to believe what I was hearing. You betrayed me, Linda. You lied to me, to our friends, to our families. You blew up our marriage, and now you're playing the victim. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said, her voice shaking. I didn't plan it. I was just lonely. Lonely. I repeated. You could have talked to me. You could have told me how you were feeling. Instead, you chose him. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel the slightest bit of sympathy. What do you want from me, John? She asked. I said I was sorry. I ended it. What else can I do? I shook my head, the anger boiling over. I don't know, Linda. Maybe start by actually taking responsibility for what you've done. She didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her purse and started for the door. I can't deal with this right now, she said. Of course you can't, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Run away. That's what you're good at. She hesitated for a moment, then walked out, slamming the door behind her. As I stood there alone, I realized something. The woman I thought I knew was gone. Maybe she'd been gone for a long time, and I was just too blind to see it. Linda's confession stayed with me, replaying in my head over and over. She admitted to the affair but still acted like she was the victim. Like I was the one pushing her too hard. It made me question every moment we'd shared. Was any of it real? She didn't come home that night, and I didn't call. I needed space. I wasn't going to beg her to explain herself anymore. The ball was in her court now. The next day, Carl called again. John, you good? No, I said flatly. But I'll survive. You should know something, Carl said, hesitating. Mark's wife found out. Apparently, she got wind of it through the same PI. What? I asked, shocked. Yeah. She's livid. She's already filed for divorce. Hearing that made my chest tighten. This wasn't just my life falling apart, it was a disaster spreading in all directions. Linda didn't just betray me, she destroyed 2 families. By evening, Linda finally came home. She looked tired, like she'd been crying. We need to figure this out, she said, her voice softer than before. There's nothing to figure out, I replied coldly. You chose him. Now you have to live with it. Her face crumbled, but I didn't care. I wasn't ready to forgive, or forget. After Linda came home, she tried to shift the conversation. She wanted to talk about moving forward, like the past could just be wiped clean. We can fix this, John, she said, sitting across from me. I made a mistake, but I still love you. I laughed bitterly. Love? You call this love? Sneaking around with your boss? Lying to me for months. I wasn't thinking straight, she said, her voice cracking. I was overwhelmed and Mark Don't, I interrupted. Don't you dare try to explain this as some accident. You made choices, Linda. Her tears started to fall, but I felt nothing. I want to fix things, she said, reaching for my hand. For us. For our family. You should have thought about that before, I said, pulling my hand away. Linda wiped her face, her expression hardening. Fine. But if you want to throw everything away, that's on you. You think it'll be easy to start over? To explain this to everyone. Her words stung, but I stayed calm. I'm not the one who destroyed this marriage, Linda. That's all on you. She stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door. I stayed in the living room, staring at the photos Carl had given me. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about my dignity, my future, and figuring out how to move on. The next morning, Linda came downstairs looking disheveled, her eyes puffy from crying. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, silent for a long moment before speaking. I've already ended things with Mark, she said quietly. Am I supposed to applaud you for that? I asked, not even looking up. I mean it, John, she continued, her voice pleading. I blocked his number. I told him we're done. I want to fix things between us. I finally looked at her. You don't get it, do you? This isn't something you can just fix. You broke it. I know I hurt you, she said, tears forming again. But I love you. I don't want to lose our family. Her words felt hollow. You weren't thinking about our family when you were meeting him in hotel rooms. She didn't respond. Instead, she put her hands over her face and started sobbing. For a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy, but I crushed it. I couldn't afford to let my emotions cloud my judgment. Linda, I said, my voice steady. If you're serious about fixing this, you need to give me space. And you need to stop acting like I'm the one making this hard. She nodded, wiping her face, but said nothing more. As she walked away, I realized something. She wasn't sorry about what she'd done. She was just sorry she got caught. For the next few days, Linda tried everything to get back into my good graces. She cooked dinners, cleaned the house, and even tried to make small talk like we were some normal couple. But every time she spoke, I could hear the lies in her voice. It wasn't the same. On the third night, she sat down beside me on the couch, her hands folded nervously in her lap. John, she started, I know you don't trust me right now. I know I don't deserve it. But I need you to see that I'm trying. I stared at the TV, not bothering to look at her. Trying doesn't undo what you've done. I know, she whispered, her voice breaking. But I can't lose you. I can't lose us. I turned to face her, finally meeting her eyes. You should have thought about that before you destroyed us. She winced, as if the words were a slap. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to sleep with your boss? To lie to me for months? To drag our marriage through the dirt? My voice rose, anger bubbling to the surface. Her tears started again, but I didn't care. I'd seen enough crying to know it wasn't guilt, it was desperation. She wanted to control the narrative, to convince me to forgive her so she could move past it. But I couldn't. Linda, I said, my voice firm, if you think this can be fixed with a few tears and apologies, you don't understand how badly you've broken this. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice trembling. Tell me and I'll do it. You can't undo this, I said flatly. The trust is gone. Every time you leave the house, I'll wonder where you're going. Every time you pick up your phone, I'll wonder who you're texting. That's no way to live. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at me like she didn't know what to say. Finally, she stood up, wiping her tears. I'll give you space, she said quietly. But I'm not giving up on us. She left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Part of me wanted to believe her, to let myself hope that things could go back to how they were. But another part, the louder part, knew that was impossible. The next day, Carl called again. How's it going? He asked. She's trying to act like everything's fine, I said. Like this is something we can just work through. Carl snorted. You don't owe her anything, John. Don't forget that. I know, I replied. But it's not that simple. Carl paused, then said, Listen, I've been thinking. You need to protect yourself. Financially, legally, whatever it takes. What are you saying? I asked, my stomach tightening. Talk to a lawyer, Carl said. Even if you're not ready to divorce her, you need to know your options. Don't let her get the upper hand. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. The idea of meeting with a lawyer felt like admitting defeat, like putting the final nail in the coffin of my marriage. But Carl was right, I couldn't just sit around and hope for the best. That afternoon, I made an appointment with a local family attorney. When I walked into the office 2 days later, I felt like a failure. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Amanda, greeted me with a firm handshake and asked me to explain my situation. By the time I finished, she looked genuinely sympathetic. I'm sorry you're going through this, she said. Infidelity cases are always tough, especially when there's a marriage and shared assets involved. I don't know what I want yet, I admitted. I just need to know what my options are. Amanda nodded. Well, the first thing we'd need to do is gather evidence. You said your brother already hired a private investigator. Yes, I said. I have photos, videos, and some details about the guy she's been seeing. Good, Amanda said. That'll help. If you decide to file for divorce, we can use that to build your case. Are there any kids involved? No, I replied, and for the first time, I felt a small sense of relief. At least we didn't have children caught in the middle of this mess. Then it's mostly a matter of dividing assets, Amanda said. Do you have a joint bank account? A mortgage? I nodded. Yeah. We own the house together. We'll figure it out, she said confidently. But my advice? Take your time. Don't rush into anything. And in the meantime, make sure you document everything. Keep a record of your conversations with her, and don't make any big financial decisions without consulting me. I left the office feeling more prepared but no less heartbroken. It was one thing to know I had options. It was another to accept that my marriage was probably over. When I got home, Linda was waiting for me in the kitchen. Where were you? She asked, trying to sound casual. Out, I replied curtly. She studied me for a moment, then said, John, please. Can we at least try to talk about this? I can't stand how things are between us. I looked at her, at the woman I once loved more than anything. We've already talked, Linda. And every time we do, you lie to me or make excuses. I told you everything, she insisted. Did you? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Because Carl told me Mark's wife has already filed for divorce. Funny how you left that part out. Her face went pale. I didn't think it mattered. It matters, I said sharply. You didn't just betray me, you destroyed another family. And you didn't even have the decency to tell me the whole truth. Linda started crying again, but I was too drained to care. I walked past her and went to my room, shutting the door behind me. Whatever hope I had left for our marriage was fading fast. The days that followed were tense. Linda stayed in the house, but it felt like she wasn't really there. She tiptoed around me, doing her best to avoid confrontation, but the silence between us was louder than any argument we could have had. One night, as I was sitting in the living room, she walked in and sat down across from me. For once, she didn't look defensive or angry. She looked defeated. I talked to Mark, she said quietly. My stomach twisted. What for? To make it clear that it's over, she replied. I told him to stay away from me, from us. I didn't know how to respond. It was what I wanted to hear, but it didn't change anything. Why now? I asked. Why not months ago, before this all blew up? I don't know, she said, tears pooling in her eyes. I was stupid. I thought I could handle it, that I could keep everything separate. But I couldn't. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. For a brief moment, I saw the woman I fell in love with, the one who always fought for us when things got tough. But that version of her had been gone for a long time, and I wasn't sure if I could ever see her the same way again. You know this doesn't fix anything, right? I said. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I know. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Carl. Carl, Mark's wife wants to talk to you. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. Me, why? Carl, she's trying to figure out what to do. Said she'd like to compare notes. I didn't like the idea of digging into the mess any further, but part of me was curious. Maybe talking to her would give me some closure, or at least confirm that I wasn't crazy for feeling like my world had fallen apart. That afternoon, I met her at a coffee shop. Her name was Sarah, and she looked as tired and broken as I felt. Thanks for meeting me, she said, her voice shaky. I know this is awkward. Yeah, I replied, not sure what else to say. She pulled out her phone and slid it across the table. I thought you might want to see these. I picked up the phone and scrolled through the messages. They were between Linda and Mark, dating back months. They weren't just professional or casual, they were deeply personal, filled with declarations of love, plans to meet, and promises to keep their affair secret. My chest tightened as I read them. This wasn't some fling. It was an emotional relationship, a betrayal on every level. I'm sorry, Sarah said, her voice breaking. I didn't know how bad it was until I found these. I handed her phone back, unable to look at it any longer. Thank you for showing me, I said. I didn't realize how deep it went. We talked for a while after that, sharing stories and piecing together the timeline of their affair. It was painful, but it also gave me clarity. This wasn't something I could sweep under the rug. Linda hadn't just made a mistake. She had chosen Mark over and over again. When I got home, Linda was waiting for me. She must have seen the look on my face because her expression shifted immediately. You talked to her, she said, more of a statement than a question. I did, I replied. She showed me the messages. Linda's face went pale, and she sank into the couch. John, I don't know what to say. Don't bother, I said, my voice cold. I've heard enough. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. I know I've hurt you, but I'm trying to fix this. Can't you see that? I shook my head. You're not trying to fix this for me. You're trying to fix it for you. Because you're scared of what happens if I walk away. That's not true, she protested. I love you. I've always loved you. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this, I said, my voice steady. You wouldn't have lied to me, betrayed me, and then tried to cover it up. Linda sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I watched her for a moment, feeling a mix of anger and pity. But mostly, I felt done. Linda, I said, my voice firm. I'm not sure there's anything left to save here. She looked up at me, her face red and tear-streaked. Please don't say that. I'm not saying it to hurt you, I replied. But I can't keep living like this. I need time to figure out what's next, for me. She didn't respond. She just sat there, crying as I walked away. Upstairs, I closed the bedroom door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of clarity. This wasn't just about what Linda wanted anymore, it was about what I needed. For the next few days, the house felt like a battlefield during a ceasefire. Linda stayed out of my way, giving me the space I'd asked for, but the tension was unbearable. Every time we crossed paths, her eyes were red, and her face carried the weight of guilt. I couldn't stop thinking about the messages Sarah had shown me. They confirmed everything I'd feared. Linda hadn't just betrayed me physically, but emotionally too. She'd chosen Mark over and over, and now she wanted to act like it could all be undone. One evening, Linda broke the silence. "John," she said softly, standing in the doorway of the living room. "What happens now?" I stared at her for a long moment before answering. "I don't know. I'll do whatever it takes," she said. "Counseling, moving away, whatever you want. Just, don't give up on us." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Linda, it's not that simple. You broke something that can't just be glued back together." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I understand," she said. "But I won't stop trying." As she walked away, I couldn't tell if her words were comforting or exhausting. I just knew that for now, I wasn't ready to make any decisions. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next. Linda kept her distance, but her efforts to fix things were painfully obvious. She cooked meals she knew I liked, cleaned the house obsessively, and even left little notes on the counter saying things like, "I'm sorry for everything." I threw them away without reading most of them. They felt empty, like a band-aid slapped on a broken bone. One night, Carl called. "Have you thought about what you're going to do?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm stuck." "You can't stay in limbo forever," Carl said. "She's trying to manipulate you into staying, you know that, right?" "Maybe," I said. "But what if she's serious? What if she really does want to change?" Carl sighed on the other end of the line. "And what if she doesn't? Can you live like this? Always wondering if she's lying, if she'll do it again?" His words hit harder than I expected. I couldn't imagine living the rest of my life in doubt, constantly questioning her every move. But the thought of walking away felt just as impossible. The next morning, I finally broke the silence with Linda. She was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, when I sat down across from her. "We need to talk," I said. She set her mug down, her face immediately tense. "Okay. I'm not saying I've made a decision yet," I began, "but if we're going to even try to fix this, it's going to take a lot more than apologies and promises." "I know," she said quickly. "I'll do whatever you need." "I mean it, Linda. That means counseling. Total transparency, your phone, your schedule, everything. And if I even get a whiff of dishonesty, we're done." She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I'll do it. I'll do anything, John." Her desperation was clear, but I couldn't tell if it was because she wanted to save our marriage or because she was terrified of the fallout if we divorced. Either way, I knew this was just the beginning. Whether I stayed or walked away, there was no easy path forward. The conversation with Linda left me feeling conflicted. Part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to think that counseling and transparency could rebuild what we'd lost. But the other part of me, the part that kept replaying those photos and messages, wasn't sure trust could ever be restored. The next day, Linda suggested we start counseling immediately. "I already looked into it," she said, her voice cautious. "There's a couples therapist with an opening this week. I can make the appointment if you're willing." I hesitated. Fine, I said. But this isn't just for us. You need individual therapy too. She nodded quickly. Whatever it takes. The therapy session was awkward and tense. The counselor, a calm and measured woman named Dr. Harris, asked us to share our sides of the story. Linda went first, admitting to the affair and describing how lonely she'd felt in our marriage. When it was my turn, I didn't hold back. I told Dr. Harris about the lies, the betrayal, and how I couldn't shake the feeling that Linda was more upset about getting caught than about what she'd done. Linda sat there crying, nodding along, but her tears didn't move me. I'd seen too many by now. Dr. Harris gave us exercises to work on at home, honesty exercises, she called them. We were supposed to sit down every night and share our feelings openly, no judgment. It sounded ridiculous, but I agreed to try. That night, we sat across from each other at the kitchen table. You start, I said, crossing my arms. Linda took a deep breath. I feel scared, she said. Scared that I've ruined everything. Scared that you'll never forgive me. I nodded but didn't respond. She stared at me, waiting. Your turn, she prompted. I feel angry, I said, my voice low. Angry that you threw away everything we built together. Angry that I can't look at you without wondering if you're lying to me. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. I know I don't deserve your trust, she said quietly. But I'll do whatever it takes to earn it back. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe we could rebuild what we had. But as I sat there staring at her, all I could think was, what if it's already too late? A week into therapy, things weren't getting any easier. The nightly honesty exercises felt forced, like we were going through the motions without addressing the deeper wounds. Linda kept saying she wanted to make things right, but her words felt hollow, like she was following a script. One night, after another tense session, I found myself staring at her phone on the counter. She'd been leaving it out in the open as a gesture of trust, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more she wasn't telling me. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. I didn't want to snoop, I hated the idea of stooping to that level, but I needed to know if there were still secrets between us. Her recent messages were clean. Too clean. But when I checked the archived messages, my stomach dropped. There, hidden away, were old texts with mark. Messages that hadn't been deleted. They weren't explicit, but they were intimate, filled with inside jokes and pet names. The timestamps showed they went back months, overlapping with the time she was reassuring me that things were fine. I put the phone down, my hands trembling. She hadn't spoken to him recently, at least, not that I could see, but the fact that she hadn't erased these messages told me she hadn't truly let go of what they had. When Linda came into the room, she immediately noticed the look on my face. What's wrong? She asked, her voice cautious. I held up her phone. I found the messages. Her face paled. John, You didn't delete them, I said, cutting her off. You kept them. Why? I forgot about those, she said quickly. I swear, I wasn't trying to hide anything. Don't lie to me, I snapped. You've had weeks to clean this up, and you still didn't. Why? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her silence said more than anything else could. That's what I thought, I said, standing up. You're not sorry about what you did. You're sorry you got caught. That's not true, she cried, grabbing my arm. I've done everything you've asked. I'm trying, John. Please don't give up on us. I pulled my arm away. I already told you, Linda. I can't rebuild this on my own. And right now, I don't think you're serious about fixing it. She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I walked upstairs, shutting the bedroom door behind me. For the first time, I felt like the decision was no longer a question of if I'd leave. It was when the next morning, I didn't bother pretending things were normal. Linda tried to make small talk over breakfast, but I shut it down with silence. She knew something had shifted. I could see it in the way she avoided eye contact, her hands trembling as she held her coffee mug. Later that day, Carl came over. He didn't say much, just sat with me on the back porch while I stared out at the yard. After a long silence, he finally spoke. You've got to decide, John, he said. You can't keep living like this. I know, I replied. But it's not that simple. Yeah, it is, Carl said. She made her choices. Now it's time for you to make yours. His words stayed with me the rest of the day. As much as I hated to admit it, he was right. This limbo wasn't helping anyone. I couldn't move forward with her, but I also couldn't keep living in the shadow of her betrayal. That evening, I sat Linda down in the living room. She looked at me with a mix of hope and dread, like she already knew what was coming. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice steady. Her eyes widened. "John, please." "No," I interrupted. "You've had chance after chance to be honest, and you've failed every time. I can't trust you anymore, Linda. I don't even know who you are." She started crying, but I didn't stop. "I've been holding on to the hope that we could fix this, but it's not working. I'm filing for divorce." Her sobs turned into gasps, and she reached for my hand. "Please don't do this," she begged. "We can go back to therapy. We can." "It's too late," I said, pulling my hand away. "I can't do this anymore. I need to move on." For a moment, she just sat there, staring at me with tears streaming down her face. Then she stood up, grabbing her purse. "If that's what you want," she said quietly, her voice breaking, "then I'll leave." And just like that, she was gone. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed through the house, leaving me in silence. That night, for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of relief. The pain was still there, but it was no longer suffocating. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I also knew it was time to start walking it. Alone, the days after Linda left were strange. The house was quieter than it had ever been, but it wasn't the oppressive silence I'd grown used to. It felt freeing. For the first time in weeks, I could think without the constant weight of her presence pressing down on me. I contacted the lawyer, Amanda, and officially started the divorce process. She assured me that with the evidence I had and no kids involved, the split would be straightforward. Even so, it felt surreal, signing the papers that would officially end a decade-long chapter of my life. Linda tried reaching out a few times, texts and voicemails saying she was sorry, that she wanted to talk, that she still loved me. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Each message felt like a faint echo from a life I was finally ready to leave behind. One afternoon, Carl stopped by with a six-pack of beer. We sat on the porch again, like we had so many times before, but this time the air between us felt lighter. "You did the right thing," he said after a while, clinking his bottle against mine. "I know," I replied. "It doesn't make it easier, though." "No, it doesn't," Carl admitted. "But at least now you can move forward." And he was right. It wasn't easy. Some nights, I still lay awake, replaying everything that had happened, wondering where it all went wrong. But each day, it hurt a little less. A few months later, the divorce was finalized. Linda moved out of state, and the house officially became mine. I kept it simple, no big celebrations, no dramatic goodbyes. Just a quiet acknowledgement that it was over, and that I had survived. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out. There was still a lot to figure out, about myself, about what I wanted, about what life could look like without her. But I wasn't afraid anymore. As I sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. It wasn't the end I'd envisioned, but it was an end. And with it came the possibility of a new beginning. For now, that was enough.